Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and this is the SMSL PAX. This is a $700 speaker amplifier. This was sent to me on loan from Apos Audio. Apos Audio has made no attempt to influence my opinion on this piece at all, so all thoughts that you are about to hear are mine and mine alone. They also ask that I put an affiliate link down in the description, so if you like what I have to say about this amp and you want to buy it, please consider using that affiliate link. I will get a small kickback if you do, and that just helps me keep the channel rolling and keep bringing you awesome content like this. Alright, so I am primarily a headphone and headphone system reviewer. This is about maybe only the third speaker amplifier that I have had the pleasure of reviewing for this channel, so we might be expanding into a new audience segment with some two-channel fans out there, wondering how this sounds for their speakers. All that. And you know what? It sounds pretty good. I actually ended up liking this amplifier a lot more than I did the SMSL VMV A1 Pro that I did recently. And it's not perfect, but it's a pretty solid package. So stick around after shameless self-promotion to find out why.
Hi, it's me again, 14 months later and a whole foot taller. Now, since Wave Theory liked the first 10,000 subscriber play button I made him, maybe he wants a 25,000 subscriber play button. This can only happen if you subscribe, though. Now, since over 60% of the watch time comes from unsubscribed viewers, I'm going to need you to subscribe. You can also sign up for his Patreon or send him money in PayPal. Links in the description. Now, on to the video.
Alright, once again, to any two-channel primary users out there, welcome. I'm Wave Theory. Again, I primarily have reviewed headphones and headphone-based gear, or gear to use with headphones, on this channel before. You may have seen me for DAC reviews, but recently there have been a rash of these gallium nitride speaker amplifiers, and this is the second one of those that I have had the privilege of reviewing so far. Yeah, so we can expand into a new viewer segment there. So welcome. Please remember to like, subscribe, do all those things you do to support YouTube channels here. Also, I tend to be quite thorough and go into detail about a lot of the things of a product. So these can get a little bit long, so I timestamp my videos out. Use those timestamps to jump around and watch the parts that are of most relevance or interest to you. Okay. The PAX, as I said, is a $700 amplifier here, and it is one of those that's part of this rash of gallium nitride amplifiers. What does that mean? Well, to go into the very, very basics of it, it is a switching amplifier that uses new transistors that are made with the material gallium nitride. And the advantage of these gallium nitride transistors, or GaNFETs as they call them, is that they switch at a much higher frequency than more traditional switching amplifiers have done. Traditional switching amplifiers do their switching somewhere in the mid 400s of kilohertz, 440, 450, somewhere in that range. Whereas SMSL claims that the GaNFET transistors here in the PAX will do the switching upwards of 1 megahertz, which is basically double, more than double what the normal switching rate is for traditional switching amps. And they say that that helps with a more accurate reproduction of the musical waveform, or amplification, an increase in amplitude of the musical waveform there because of that higher switching. But again, there are several variants of the gallium nitride or GaNFET amplifiers out there anymore. This is the second one I've had in for review, or at least published a review for. The first one was the SMSL VMV A1 Pro, which I will put a link to down in the description as well. This one is just a little bit more expensive than that unit and also has a more fully fleshed out feature set. And again, I think it's the more compelling product overall. It is the more complete package overall over the VMV A1 Pro, and so we'll spend the rest of the video talking about why. All right, now the power output on this amplifier is rated with some pretty gaudy numbers here. So SMSL claims that into an 8 ohm load, this thing is capable of 200 watts per channel output, and that becomes 250 watts per channel into a 4 ohm output, and that is if you run it in stereo. You have the option of buying 2 of these units and running each of them in bridged mono mode, which means then that each unit would essentially operate operate as a monoblock power amplifier that will bypass all internal volume control and everything on this unit. And if you do that, it's rated at 500 watts of output power into one channel into an 8 ohm load. And I think you do need to use an 8 ohm load there. I didn't see a power spec for 4 ohm load. It is not rare for a stereo amp when bridged to mono to lose the ability to drive 4 ohm loads in there. It's probably safer to stick with an 8 ohm load. Okay, so I said a lot in there, and this amp has multiple functions to it. It can behave essentially as an integrated amplifier, where it is a speaker amp, but it has an integrated preamplifier so that you can handle volume control right from the front panel or with the included remote control. It has one of those too. Okay, so basically integrated amplifier mode there. It also has the option of being a pure power amplifier where you can bypass the internal volume control here and use it just straight up as a power amplifier, maximum volume output. You will need an outboard preamplifier, something to control volume if you do it that way. And I believe that mode is accessible whether this is in stereo or mono in there, so you've got your choice there if you want to go that route. Now, I only have one unit here in for review, so I used this as a stereo amp. Unfortunately, I was not sent two, so I can't talk about how it behaves as a monoblock amplifier as a stereo pair in there. All right, so with that, let's get on with the rest of the review. First of all, let's talk about the build. It is essentially just built into this case of aluminum, basically. We have, it's not like one full panel here. It looks like we've got an aluminum panel on top, and then you can kind of see a seam right here where the front panel is also aluminum, and then we have an aluminum plate basically on the bottom, and then we have like metal heat sinking here on either side panel, like so. The back panel is also made out of, I think, that feels a little bit more plasticky to me in there, okay? But I think the rest of it is metal, except for this accent front panel right here, which actually is not all screen. The screen area is like this. Okay, I will put a picture in the thumbnail of this video of the screen lit up so you can see it really is a fairly small display on there. Gives you critical information like volume level and like where the output setting is. Like you can manually set whether this is going into an 8 ohm or a 4 ohm load. I basically left it at 8 ohm in there because my speakers that I have to test with are either 6 or 8 ohm. So I left it on the 8 ohm setting. Okay, and then you also have like which input is selected on there as well. Okay. The volume number is big enough to read across small to medium-sized rooms. The impedance setting and the input indicator, though, are pretty small text on that display. So you can read them while sitting at a desktop if this is your desktop speaker amplifier. From a couch across the room, much more difficult to read that. Okay. So that's the front panel. Then so that's this part of the front panel. Then we have this button here, which is push and hold for standby on and off. It's also the volume control when you are, listening to music and all of that. It also is once the unit is on, you push it in to enter the menu mode. Then you can navigate the menu, and then you hit it again to make your selection. Okay, on there as well. Okay, round back. All right, we have the pretty standard stuff. We've got the power input, master rocker power switch here. We have 5-way binding posts for the 2 channels of speaker amplification. Then we have 2 inputs. We have RCA single-ended, and then we have 3-pin XLR balanced right here. So again, you have 2 inputs on this, 1 single-ended, 1 balanced. Now, I really did not notice any meaningful change in sound quality between the single-ended and balanced inputs here. They both seemed pretty good. I used high-quality sources to go into either of them. It's very difficult to directly compare the balance and single-ended input quality on an amplifier because the balance and single-ended output quality on most pieces of source gear is not equal. Okay, but I used both inputs. They both sounded quite good. Okay, Let me show you the remote one more time here. It takes AAA batteries, which are not included. It's fairly standard for an SMSL remote control. It's the RC8A. If you've seen SMSL remote controls before, it's the same one. Simple but functional, gets the major functions done. It is easier to navigate the menu with the remote control than it is from the front panel multifunction knob. So keep this handy here. It will make your life easier in that regard. And I have so many of these remote controls that I actually had to stick on a label, so I made sure I sent the right remote control back to Apos with this unit when I am done with it. All right. But other than that, like, it's got some heft to it. It's not super heavy, but it's got a rather compact form factor in there. It is well made. It feels solid when you pick it up and so forth. And I mean, it's pretty dead when you knock on it and that sort of thing. I mean, it's a well-built, well-made unit. Moderately heavy, compact footprint. It runs warm, but never really hot. Like, I didn't have any issues stacking this on top of anything or stacking anything else on top of it. In terms of temperature and all that, like, again, it just gets moderately warm, never really hot. Doesn't necessarily run cool either, though. So, I mean, just those are things to be aware of. You are going to want to give it just a little bit of room to breathe. But there's no fan or anything like that. All of the heat management, thermal management is just done through the heat sinking. All right, as we transition to sound then, let me label the test gear that I used for this, and we'll start with the speakers because that is a shorter list. 2 pairs of speakers that I used primarily to test this. When this was plugged in at my desktop setup, it was driving a pair of Yamo C93 Mark IIs, which are routed through a Monoprice 12-inch 100-watt subwoofer that doesn't have a model name. That's what it's called. Okay, using the high-level outputs and about 100 ohm crossover frequency right there. So the speaker outs from the PAX went through that subwoofer and then to the Yamo speakers there on my desktop. I then moved the unit to my 2-channel system where it drove a pair of ELAC Unify UB52 speakers, both full range with no subwoofers, and then also I looped in my SVS SB1000 subwoofers, a pair of them there in that configuration. On the 2-channel system, the DAC that I would have used, or the source that I would use was a Chord Hugo 2 DAC with a matching 2Go streamer plugged right in there. That 2Go streamer was used as a Roon endpoint, playing FLAC files that were either high-res or lossless or DSD files. Okay, locally. In the case of FLAC files, those could have been local or streamed from Qobuz, again through Roon. And then when I was not using the subwoofers, the variable output of that Hugo 2, I would set its volume level to blue. If you know how the output wheel on that thing works, variable output, you set its color to blue. That's basically line level output, as my understanding on that. And then that would just go directly into the RCA inputs of the PAX. If I used the subwoofers, then I would go from the Hugo 2 to the subwoofers via RCA. There's an RCA loop through in there that has a crossover, again set at about 100 hertz, and then RCA connections from there into the RCA input on the PAX. On my desktop system, I used a plethora of sources. Again, I'm a digital music listener, so all of the music files that I would have said there would have been common here to the desk system as well. Multiple DACs there, however, which include but are not limited to the Live Micro DAC, the Shit Bifrost 2/64, Topping Centaurus, Berkeley Alpha Series 2, and Lampezator Baltic 3. All of those got some time. Also the Shit Mimir, which was in for review in here as well, got some time on that as well. All of those basically would have been connected via XLR into this, sometimes through a little bare 3-way XLR switch in there. Okay. And then downstream from that, so then again, XLR from the DACs into the amplifier there. I've talked about the speakers that were used. The other thing that I tried there on my desk system is I have a Zinsonics C-Box 2, which is an outboard output transformer, basically, which allows you to drive headphones from a speaker amp, the speaker outputs of a speaker amp, and presents between about a 6 and 10 ohm load, as I understand it, to the amplifier, depending on the headphone impedance in there. And so I did try driving headphones off of this through that C-Box 2, and that included some really high-end stuff like the Hi-Fi Min Susvara, just as an example in there to really hear what this thing could do, because my headphone game is stronger than my speaker game, and I wanted to know the true capabilities of this amp. All right, let's get into it. So what is the sound of the PAX like? Mostly neutral in perceived frequency response, maybe just a little bit of perceived bass forwardness in the deep bass there a little bit. And it's got some punchy, potent low end to it, but through the rest of the frequency spectrum is a little bit more laid back, and it creates an overall smooth and refined and relaxed kind of presentation to it. It has a reasonable amount of spatial holography and three-dimensionality to it, decent imaging and separation, and maybe not world-beating, but pretty solid resolution and detail retrieval. All right, let's unpack all of those things here a little bit more in a little bit more detail. All right, that perceived frequency response in there. Again, it's going to fall into the range of what most people are going to consider neutral. I did, however, detect that the deep bass region of the frequency spectrum does seem to be a little bit more comparatively forward on this amplifier than the other speaker amplifiers that I have access to. That list is not super long. It includes, for the time being, that other SMSL VMV A1 Pro that I mentioned, but the amp that I've been using on my 2-channel system for a while now is an old, like, vintage Adcom GFA 555 Mark II, which is a brute. Okay, lots of output power, class AB, but the PAX just sounded a little bit more bass forward to me, even like when driving those ELAX full range no subs. Okay, again, a little bit more bass forward than that Adcom amp does. I also have a Parasound Zone Amp V3 around. The topping B200 monoblocks have come in for review. I haven't had a whole lot of time with them. Ditto, the live GANM monoblock amps are in right now, and I have very limited time with those as well. But the point is, from what little I've heard, either a lot that I've heard from that list that I mentioned, or little I've heard from that, like just the PAX just seems to emphasize the really deep bass just a little bit, comparatively speaking. Okay, so it's got good impact and good rumble and good control in the low end. My ELAX, when they were running full range, no subs, I was pretty impressed with the bass output that I was getting from the PAX there. You know, it's not quite room shaking because those are just 5 1/4 inch woofers on those speakers, but like there was some impact there and I could feel it, and I was surprised by the amount of rumble that I was getting out of those, and like the bass was nice and tightly controlled. Again, just comparatively a little bit forward in the presentation. Now, the rest of the frequency response seems to have very good tonality to it. Excellent realistic balance between fundamental frequencies and their harmonics, even in my room, which is not acoustically ideal. What you see behind me right here is like a fleece blanket held over some acoustic panels that are about an inch thick and are fading in color, which is why I covered them up, right? And so that's on the wall behind me. The speakers are like behind the camera position here in this room. So like I'm almost sitting in my listening position for my 2-channel system as I film this. I'm about 18 inches further forward into the room when I listen, okay, on there as well. To my right is like the family library and a bunch of shelves full of books and also audio gear that I keep in rotation to pull out to check things here and there. So that acts as kind of a diffuser and that sort of thing in there. To my left is where my desk is, my main computer desk that I have, where I do a lot of my headphone evaluation, video editing, and all of that kind of stuff. So not an ideal room. It's in a basement, concrete floors, okay, all that. I do have a fairly large area rug that is just, it's not a thick rug at all, but it is on the floor that's otherwise a linoleum floor right on top of concrete, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. Okay, as far as the acoustics, and even with those less than ideal circumstances in the room, the tonality through those ELACs and the Yamos in a near field setup, through the PAX, through the mid-range and the treble, was pretty well balanced. However, it had an overall smooth profile to it. It was a very relaxed and refined kind of sound. Not lacking in detail, not lacking in resolution, just smooth on the delivery, laid back in the presentation on that. Okay. But again, just mostly neutral. Okay. Soundstage is a little bit wider than the speakers, not a whole lot. Okay, and it's not super tall either. I say that because my Adcom amp, the old Adcom, can throw a really tall soundstage. The PAX doesn't quite do that there. But it does have a decent amount of depth to it as well. So it's not completely 3D in there, maybe 2.5D, 2.7D, where the 0.5 or 0.75 is in the height dimension there just a little bit. However, imaging seems pretty good. Imaging and separation, there's a fairly strong sense of where sounds are and where they're not. In other words, the imaging being the positive, a sound is right here, and the separation being the negative of spatial presentation, just telling you there's not sound right here. Okay, there's space between sounds. It's done in a fairly realistic way here for the price. Okay, on that. So no complaints there really too. And you put all of those things together, with the punchy bass and the control that it has to do some of the fine detail and resolution that it needs to do that spatial presentation, the output power on this is solid, right? One of the issues that I had with the VMV A1 Pro is that on my, again, modest 2-channel system here, I could really tell that at higher volumes and with busy music that VMV A1 Pro was starting to run out of gas. So even though it really also had a high power output spec on it, it seemed like the power supply on that amplifier was not sufficient to the task. And the busier the music got and the higher the volume got and all of that, it really started to run out of steam and turned that spatial presentation a bit mushier, lost a lot of its definition and clarity and instrument and vocal separation and all of that. The PAX did a much better job of that. It hit that wall much higher up in volume and in musical complexity, right? If I put the 1812 Overture on here, with the cannon fire and the full symphony orchestra and a handbell choir and all of that going on at once, yes, the spatial presentation could get a little bit mushy, but what I observed is that it got no mushier than what happens with my Adcom amplifier, which has plenty of power and control, and that sort of thing. And I think what's happening is that if the PAX hits a wall where its output power becomes hampered, which, given the gaudy power output spec and the size of this unit and the size of the power supply, there probably is that limit somewhere. It's just beyond what my ELAC and Yamo speakers are capable of finding. Okay, so I think the mushiness of the spatial presentation that I was getting there, again, was not over and above anything I've heard from any other amp in my room, and it just came down to the fact that my ELAC speakers are good, but they're middle $100 speakers, and so you ask them to do too much, you can ask them to do too much sometimes, right? And they let me know that, okay? But the point that I want to make here is that line for the PAX was higher than the VMV A1 Pro, is higher than my little Parasound Zone Amp V3, also, which just also runs into some power issues with this under the same conditions, so forth. But it was right there with my Adcom amp in terms of holding everything together when music gets busy and it gets loud. I crank up the volume and all of that, right? That helped. Now, subwoofers helped too. But I don't think the subwoofers help clean up that spatial presentation because it offloads some driver motion when using a crossover anyway. when using a high pass filter to the speakers, I should say, right? When you actually filter out bass to send it to the subwoofers and then not run your speakers full range. One of the key advantages of doing that is like the drivers, particularly the woofers of the speakers, are less busy. And so some of that mushiness got delayed and cleaned up a little bit. But again, that was basically equal with the ADCOM in there as well. So that to me, again, was like, yes, subwoofers help, but the mushiness that I was getting, it comes down to the speakers I was using and not the amp, okay, on there. And so that stands in contrast to some of the other lower powered amps and that SMSL VMV A1 Pro that I already used or already mentioned here. Okay, so I mean, that just brings me back to, like, I think the PAX is a pretty solid value. It may be a little bit too laid back and relaxed sounding for some people. I don't know how well it's going to power, like, medium and low sensitivity speakers in a big room. Just given the power supply that's in it, I don't know how well that's going to work. I was unable to test that. But under my listening conditions of near field at a desk in a small-ish, maybe small, medium-sized room here with moderately difficult to drive bookshelf speakers. It passed all of the tests, and I think the limitations I heard were from the speakers and not the amp. Okay, so I mean, that to me is like probably the primary use case of this. You're either going to use it to drive the speakers at a near field desktop system, or, you know, moderately to easy to drive speakers in a small to medium room. Just given the size of this unit and the price of this unit, I think that's going to be the most common application, and it seems very comfortable there. So if that's the way you need to use a speaker amp, go for it. Okay, I think it's in stereo mode and you only want one. Okay, here it goes. Nice to have that. Now, before I go, I am going to mention, like, that I like that it has both a balanced and a single-ended input on it. And the reason that I like that is because there are just so many sources out there. If you're a digital music listener, the DAC market is just saturated right now with balanced DACs that sound better from their balanced outputs than their single-ended input. So that it has a full stereo input of balanced connections there is another reason why I think it's a more compelling overall package than the VMV A1 Pro, which only had the single XLR input on it that you could only access when that was in monoblock mode. Okay, so that you can access this in here in stereo mode is an advantage this one has. But then you still have that pretty decent RCA input in there too. So if you use your digital or the balanced input for your digital stuff and you're also a turntable user, you can run your turntable preamp right into the single-ended input on there and that. So I think that is not a feature to be overlooked either. So when you put together the build, the performance, and the connectivity options of this unit here, I think $700 is a pretty fair price and you get a fairly high quality product. How did it sound with headphones there? Like, that's if you're going to use it for speakers. How did it sound for headphones? I wouldn't use it as a primary headphone amp, not because it's good, but just to get that output, like that C-Box 2 that I mentioned is like $500, close to $500 starting price. How did it sound with the Susvara? Nicely detailed. Like, I was getting more resolution and detail out of the PAX through the Susvara, their headphone, $6,000 headphone, if you're unfamiliar, right? I was hearing subtle details from there that I was not getting from my 2-channel system. So the signal coming out of the amplifier had a lot of the subtle details, had the spatial coherence that the speakers, I think, were lacking in there. One example that comes to mind is the track Why So Serious by Hans Zimmer from the Dark Knight film soundtrack. There's a big bass drop in there, and in the middle of that really heavy synthesized bass line, which my speakers were not handling, okay? But actually was the PAX controlled the Susvara pretty well during that, right? Gave it nice, tight control over there, okay? But there is a very lightly played snare drum that sounds kind of off in the distance, okay, in that track too. And like my 2-channel system, the speakers were not resolving that, but I did hear that through the PAX on the Susvara. So I do think that its resolution and detail retrieval is reasonably good too. And it came through on the headphones, not on the speakers, just because my headphone game is much much stronger than my speaker game right now. Hopefully that will even out going forward. Okay. The only complaint that I have there is I thought that the sound with the Susvara was just a little bit brighter than the Susvara usually is. And I don't know if that's an artifact of using the C-Box 2 or if it was just the power demand of the Susvara was not quite met by the PAX or whatever, what have you. But it was just a little bit brighter and more sibilant than the Susvara normally is. But it was a useful test in there to talk again about the resolution and the detail retrieval and the holography that this unit is capable of and there all that. So you can drive pretty high quality speakers and probably will want to drive pretty high quality speakers with the PAX as well. So again, I think it's a fairly well fleshed out quality product that I'm fairly comfortable recommending. So yeah, if you have either a desktop speaker system or a medium or small room with medium or easy to drive speakers in there and want to go stereo mode, SMSL PAX is a good option. I cannot speak to how it performs as a monoblock with harder driving speakers in a big room. That's just not a situation I was able to test. But under the circumstances I used, okay, it gets thumbs up for me. So that'll be my review of the SMSL PAX amplifier. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment. Check out my PayPal, my Patreon. Consider a channel membership, which is a new thing that is running too. Thanks again for watching, and as always, enjoy the music.